14 years old. That is how old Eva Mercer was when she sat in a courtroom surrounded by armed guards and listened to the names of her victims read aloud. Her father, her mother, her 2 younger brothers. 4 names, 4 lives. One family erased in a single night by the youngest person sitting in that room. She did not cry when the charges were read. She did not tremble when the photographs were shown. She tilted her chin upward, glanced at a flashing camera outside the courtroom doors, and smirked. She believed her age was a shield no court could pierce. She was certain that no judge would dare, but the evidence waiting in that room did not care how old she was, and the sentence that was coming would prove that justice does not ask for a birth certificate before it speaks. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and tell us what you think below. This is how it all began. 8 months before that courtroom, before the chains and the cameras and the silence that swallowed the room whole, Eva Mercer was still the bright, polished daughter of a decorated police inspector named Daniel Mercer. She lived in a clean house on a quiet government street in a jurisdiction where families like hers were supposed to represent everything that was safe about the world. Her father wore a badge. Her mother counseled troubled children for a living. Her 2 younger brothers still believed that their big sister was the smartest person they knew. Neighbors called her gifted. Teachers called her mature. No one called her dangerous. But behind the closed doors of that house, something had already begun to shift. A second phone hidden inside a hollow textbook. Messages to a man no one in the family had ever met. A quiet fury building behind a face that had learned far too young how to smile while calculating. And one night, while the rest of the Mercer family slept in the only place they believed was safe, Eva made a decision that would turn their home into a crime scene and her name into a verdict no one in that city would ever forget. The story of how a police officer's own daughter used his training against him, staged a false invasion, and nearly walked free, begins not with the crime, but with the family that never imagined the threat was already living inside their walls. The courtroom was full, but it felt hollow. Every seat was occupied, and yet the room carried the kind of silence that only arrives when people are too stunned to breathe. Journalists sat with pens frozen above notebooks. Family members clutched each other with whitened knuckles. Officers in dress uniform lined the back wall like a human barricade between the public and the proceedings. And in the center of it all, seated behind a narrow wooden table with her wrists resting in her lap, was Eva Mercer. 14 years old, small for her age, wearing a pressed juvenile uniform that someone had clearly ironed for her that morning. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her posture was upright, and her face carried an expression so vacant, so deliberately empty, that it unsettled everyone who looked at her. She did not look like a girl on trial for her life. She looked like a girl waiting for a class she did not want to attend. The clerk stood to the left of the judge's bench and began reading the case summary in a flat procedural voice that gave no weight to the horror underneath the words. 4 counts of aggravated homicide. Victim 1, Inspector Daniel Mercer, aged 44. Victim 2, Claire Mercer, aged 41. Victim 3, Owen Mercer, aged 11. Victim 4, Micah Mercer, aged 8. Each name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of grief outward from the families seated in the gallery. Claire's father closed his eyes when his daughter's name was spoken. Daniel's former partner pressed a fist against his own thigh and held it there as if the pressure could keep him from breaking. And Eva, the girl accused of ending all 4 of those lives in a single night, did not react to any of the names. She blinked once during Owen's, she shifted slightly during Micah's, but she never looked down. She never turned toward the gallery. She never acknowledged that those names belonged to the people who had raised her, protected her, and loved her without condition. The lead prosecutor rose from his chair with the kind of deliberate slowness that experienced trial lawyers use when they want the room to feel the gravity of what is coming. He buttoned his jacket. He adjusted his glasses. He placed both hands flat on the table in front of him and let the silence stretch just a beat longer than was comfortable. Then he spoke. He told the jury that this was not a home invasion. This was not a revenge attack against a police officer. So this was not the random act of strangers who broke in through a window and left chaos behind. This, he said, was a family destroyed from the inside. This was a daughter who drugged her own parents, retrieved her father's backup weapon using a code she had stolen through weeks of careful observation, and then moved through the house room by room, while the people who trusted her most were unable to defend themselves. He said the evidence would show planning. It would show patience. It would show a level of calculation that should disturb every person sitting in that courtroom, regardless of the defendant's age. Eva's defense attorney placed a hand briefly on her shoulder during the prosecutor's opening. It was a gesture meant to humanize her, to remind the jury that this was still a child, still small, still young enough that her feet barely reached the floor beneath the table. But Eva did not lean into the comfort. She did not acknowledge the touch at all. She sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed somewhere between the judge's bench and the far wall, as if she had already decided that nothing said in this room would matter. And for a brief, almost imperceptible moment, when a camera flash went off outside the courtroom doors and sent a flicker of white light across the glass partition, Eva Mercer smiled. It was not a grin. It was not a laugh. It was a micro-expression, a half-second curl at the corner of her mouth, the kind of involuntary reaction that most people would miss. But the camera did not miss it. And neither did the victims' families. 8 months earlier, that smile had belonged to a different version of Eva. Or at least that is what everyone who knew her would later say. 8 months earlier, she was still attending school with above-average grades. She was still helping her mother organize charity events for the police department. She was still reading books in her room, wearing braces and arguing with her younger brothers about whose turn it was to choose the television channel. The Mercer household had problems, as all families do, but from the outside it looked like a home held together by routine, discipline, and the particular kind of pride that comes from having a father who risks his life for the community. No one who lived on that quiet government street, no one who attended those charity dinners, no one who watched Eva Mercer smile politely at adults and hold doors open for elderly neighbors would have believed that this same girl was capable of what the prosecutor had just described. And that disbelief was part of what made the case so devastating, because it meant that everyone who loved her had been standing right next to the danger and never felt it. But the evidence did not care about appearances. The evidence did not care that she was 14, or that she had once won a school essay contest, or that her pediatrician still kept cartoon stickers on the wall of her examination room. One piece of evidence in particular had been sitting in police hands for nearly 12 hours before anyone understood what it meant. A neighbor's motion-activated security camera, mounted on a fence post facing the side alley between the two properties, had recorded a single continuous clip beginning at 3:12 in the morning on the night of the killings. There were no masked men in that footage. There were no intruders climbing fences or fleeing into vehicles. There was only Eva Mercer walking calmly into the side yard of her family home, carrying a dark trash bag, pausing near the drainage grate, and then returning inside without urgency. She closed the gate behind her so gently that the latch did not make a sound. That footage would become the spine of the prosecution's case. It would be played in that courtroom more than a dozen times. And it would follow Eva Mercer into sentencing like a shadow she could never wash away. The judge who would oversee the trial was a man named Victor Callahan. He was in his 60s with deep-set eyes and a voice that never rose above the volume of a calm conversation, even when the courtroom erupted around him. He was known in legal circles for two things. First, he believed that the law was a structure, not a weapon, and he treated every person who entered his courtroom with the same measured tone regardless of what they were accused of. Second, he had never once been overturned on sentencing, not because he was harsh, because he was precise. He understood the weight of language, the power of restraint, and the difference between punishment and theater. When Eva Mercer's case was assigned to his bench, several attorneys quietly noted that she could not have drawn a worse judge for the strategy her defense team was likely to pursue, because Victor Callahan did not respond to performance. He responded to truth. And the truth in this case had already been captured on a grainy camera at 3:12 in the morning, walking calmly through a gate with a trash bag that smelled of blood. The chapter of this story that begins in the courtroom is really the end. The real beginning lives 8 months in the past, in a house with warm lights and open curtains, on a street where a police officer believed the most dangerous part of his life happened outside his front door. That house still stands. The curtains are closed now. The lights have not been on in months. But on the last evening before everything changed, the Mercer home looked exactly the way it had always looked. Ordinary, safe, loved. And completely unaware that the person who would destroy it was already sitting at the dinner table, eating with the family, and silently deciding that none of them would see the morning. Inspector Daniel Mercer was the kind of man who believed that the world made sense if you followed the rules. He woke at 5:15 every morning without an alarm. He pressed his uniforms the night before and hung them on the same hook behind the bedroom door. He polished his boots on Sundays and lined them beneath the hallway bench in a row so neat it looked almost ceremonial. He ate breakfast standing at the kitchen counter because he said sitting down slowed the morning rhythm, and he kissed his wife Claire on the forehead before leaving because that was the routine, and routines were how Daniel Mercer kept his household running. He was not a cold man. He was not cruel. But he was structured in the way that certain officers become after years of working in environments where chaos is the default and discipline is the only defense against it. He brought that discipline home with him every night and applied it to everything, from the volume of the television to the bedtime of his children. Claire Mercer was different in almost every way that mattered. Where Daniel was rigid, Claire was soft. Where Daniel gave orders, Claire gave choices. She worked as a school counselor at a nearby primary school, spending her days sitting across from anxious children, helping them name feelings they did not yet have vocabulary for, guiding parents through conversations they were afraid to start. She was patient in the way that only people who genuinely enjoy listening to others can be. She laughed easily. She cried at commercials. She kept handwritten notes in a counseling journal because she believed that writing by hand made her think more carefully than typing ever could. Her colleagues described her as the person everyone went to when they did not know what to say. She had a gift for finding the right words, and an even rarer gift for knowing when no words were needed at all. In the Mercer household, Claire was the emotional center, the one who smoothed arguments before they became conflicts, who noticed when the atmosphere changed, who stayed up late. Not because she was anxious, but because she wanted to make sure every member of her family had been heard before the day ended. Owen was 11 and built almost entirely out of energy and admiration. He wanted to be a police officer like his father. He wore a plastic badge to school until a teacher gently told him it was against the dress code. He lined his toy police cruisers on his windowsill and narrated high-speed chases to himself in bed before falling asleep. He asked his father questions about the job constantly, questions Daniel answered with careful honesty, never glamorizing the violence, but never hiding the reality either. Owen worshipped his father in the uncomplicated way that children worship people they have not yet learned to see as flawed. Micah was 8, quieter than his brother, and still young enough to sleep with a blanket that had long since become too small for him. He folded it beside his pillow every night and pulled it against his chest when the house made sounds he did not recognize. He was afraid of thunderstorms, but not of the dark. He drew pictures of his family at school and always put Ava in the middle because she was the tallest. In his mind, his big sister was the most important person in the house after his parents. He trusted her completely. He had no reason not to. Ava was the contradiction the family never fully understood. To adults, she was poised, articulate, and unusually self-aware for her age. She could hold conversations with Daniel's colleagues at department events without fidgeting or looking away. She could charm elderly neighbors into giving her compliments simply by asking about their health and remembering their answers. Teachers wrote glowing comments on her report cards. She was described as mature, composed, empathetic, and driven. But those descriptions belonged to the version of Eva that operated in public spaces, the version that had been carefully assembled over years of watching which behaviors earned approval and which ones did not. The private Eva, the one her friends and classmates saw when adults left the room, was a different creature entirely. She could be cutting and theatrical. She mocked people who showed weakness and cataloged their insecurities for later use. She treated friendship as a game of access rather than affection, drawing people close when she needed them, and discarding them without explanation when she did not. And she responded to embarrassment correction, or denial with a quiet fury that most people mistook for sulking, but which a few of her closer friends recognized as something more deliberate. She did not want comfort, she wanted control. The cracks in the Mercer household had been growing for months, but they were the kind of cracks that families learn to step around rather than repair. Claire noticed that small amounts of money were disappearing from her purse. Daniel noticed that Eva's explanations for her whereabouts had become suspiciously precise, the kind of detail that liars add because they think specificity equals believability. Ava had acquired a second phone, hidden inside a hollowed-out textbook on her shelf, and through that phone she had been communicating with a man named Leon Voss. Voss was 23 years old, a drifter with a petty criminal record, and a talent for telling young people exactly what they wanted to hear. He had met Eva through an anonymous messaging platform and had spent weeks building a relationship that made her feel seen, chosen, and superior to the family she was growing to resent. He told her she was special. He told her she was trapped. He told her the people who controlled her life did not deserve her loyalty. And Ava, who had always believed she was smarter than the people around her, absorbed those words not as manipulation, but as confirmation. Daniel discovered the messages on a Tuesday evening. He did not shout. He did not strike the table or raise his hand. He sat Eva down in the kitchen, placed the phone between them, and told her in the same calm, procedural tone he used at work that the communication was over. The phone was confiscated immediately. Internet access in the house was restricted. And Daniel and Claire had begun discussing, in quiet conversations Eva was not supposed to hear, the possibility of sending her to live temporarily with Claire's sister in another town for what they called stability. It was not punishment in Daniel's mind. It was extraction. The same way he would remove an officer from a compromised situation, he intended to remove his daughter from a dangerous influence before it could deepen. But Ava did not interpret the intervention as protection. She interpreted it as erasure. They were not saving her. They were dismantling the only version of her life that felt like it belonged to her. She said almost nothing during the confrontation, which should have alarmed Daniel more than any shouting would have. Silence from Eva was never silence. It was calculation. The last dinner the Mercer family shared together was unremarkable in every way, except the one that mattered most. Claire made pasta. The boys argued about a television show. Daniel ate quietly, still carrying the tension of the phone discovery, but choosing not to reopen the wound at the table. Claire tried to soften the atmosphere, tried to bridge the distance between her husband and her daughter with gentle conversation and redirected questions. Ava participated just enough to avoid suspicion. She passed the salt. She answered questions. She even laughed once at something Micah said, and Claire took that laugh as a sign of healing. It was not healing. It was performance. Beneath the table, beneath the forced normalcy, Ava was looking at each member of her family with an expression no one at that table understood. She was measuring them. She was calculating what her life would feel like if none of them were in it anymore. Daniel pushed his chair back at the end of the meal, placed his plate in the sink, and turned to Ava with the only words he would ever speak to her again. He said, "Tomorrow this stops." He meant the conflict. He meant the secrets. He meant whatever dark thread had woven itself into his daughter's life. Ava looked up at him and answered with 2 words that settled over the room like a thin sheet of ice. She said, "You're right." The words were correct. The tone was cooperative, but something in the delivery was too smooth, too agreeable, too perfectly crafted to end the conversation without leaving a trace. Claire noticed. She looked at Ava for a long moment after Daniel left the kitchen, but she did not say anything. Mothers sometimes sense danger without being able to name it, and Claire Mercer, the woman who spent her career helping other people's children, would carry the weight of that unnamed instinct into a grave she did not deserve. The Mercer house settled into its nighttime rhythm the way it always did, with the quiet accumulation of small domestic sounds that families rarely notice until they are gone forever. The pipes ticked as the heating adjusted. The washing machine hummed through a delayed cycle that Claire had started before dinner. Bedroom doors drifted open and closed with the kind of gentle movement caused by air pressure shifting between rooms. Daniel placed his backup firearm in the lockbox on the top shelf of the bedroom closet and set the combination lock the way he always did, using a 4-digit code he believed only he and Claire knew. He set his watch on the nightstand. He checked his phone for department notifications. He kissed Claire on the forehead and turned off the lamp. Claire had already taken her prescribed sleep medication, a mild sedative she used for the insomnia that had worsened over the past year. The boys had gone to bed an hour earlier, Owen falling asleep mid-sentence, and Micah pulling his too small blanket against his chest the way he did every night, as if it were a shield against the world. Ava waited. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark with her door closed and listened to the house become quiet, the way a hunter listens for a forest to stop moving. She had rehearsed this night in her mind dozens of times, but she had never allowed herself to set a date until now. The phone had been taken. The internet had been cut. The conversation about sending her away had been overheard through a vent in the hallway while her parents thought she was asleep. Every exit was closing. Every option she believed she had was being removed by the 2 people who slept in the room at the end of the hall. And so she sat in the dark and counted the minutes the way her father had once taught her to count breaths during anxiety. Slowly, deliberately, and without emotion. When the house had been silent for 45 minutes, she stood, opened her door without turning the handle so the latch would not click, and walked barefoot toward the kitchen. She had crushed the sedative tablets 2 days earlier and stored the powder in a folded piece of notebook paper inside her desk drawer. Yet that detail would later become one of the prosecution's most devastating pieces of evidence because it proved this was not a sudden eruption of teenage rage. It was preparation. It was planning carried out over days by a mind that understood cause and effect and chose to move forward anyway. In the kitchen, she prepared 2 mugs of cocoa, dissolved the powder into both, and carried them down the hall to her parents' bedroom. She knocked softly and told Claire she was sorry about everything and wanted to make a peace offering before bed. Claire, already drowsy from her own medication, accepted the gesture with a tired smile and drank most of the mug before setting it on the nightstand. Daniel drank less, but enough. Ava took the mugs back to the kitchen, rinsed them, and waited again. This time she did not count minutes. She counted sounds. When her father's breathing shifted into the deep, rhythmic pattern she had learned to recognize over years of living in the same house, she moved. The lockbox code was something she had obtained through a method that would chill the courtroom when it was later revealed. Over a period of several weeks, Ava had positioned herself at the far end of the hallway during evenings when Daniel retrieved or stored his backup weapon. The hallway mirror, mounted on the opposite wall, at an angle Daniel had never considered a security risk, reflected just enough of his hand movement for her to reconstruct the 4-digit combination through repeated observation. She did not guess the code. She studied it. She watched her own father the way a criminal watches a target, and she used the tools available in her own home to defeat his precautions. When she opened the lockbox that night, the mechanism clicked once. She paused, listened. No sound from the bedroom. She removed the weapon, checked that it was loaded, because Daniel always stored it loaded as a precaution against emergencies, and stood in the hallway with it in both hands. What happened next was reconstructed through forensic evidence, blood pattern analysis, ballistic trajectories, and the physical state of each room. Daniel was the first. He was shot while turning in the bed, likely roused by a sound or a shift in the air that his instincts registered even through the sedative fog. The trajectory showed he had begun to rise onto one elbow when the round struck. He did not have time to reach his service weapon. He did not have time to call out. Claire woke into confusion rather than comprehension. The sedative in her system, compounded by the additional dosage Eva had administered, slowed her reactions enough that she never fully understood what was happening. She was near the edge of the mattress, oriented toward Daniel, when the second shot came. The forensic team later noted that the arrangement of the bedding suggested she had been reaching for her husband, not running from her daughter. Even in the final seconds of her life, her instinct was to protect. The boys' rooms were next. Owen's scene showed no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no indication that he had woken before the end came. He was still in the position he fell asleep in, on his side, one arm draped over the edge of the mattress, his toy police cruiser on the floor beside the bed, where it had rolled during the night. Micah was different. Micah woke. The forensic evidence indicated that he had turned in his bed and opened his eyes before the final moment. The angle of the wound, the position of his body, and the disturbance of his blanket all pointed to a child who had looked up and seen the person standing in his doorway. He saw his sister. He would have known her silhouette in the dark the way any younger sibling knows the shape of the person they trust most in the house. Whether he spoke or reached out or simply stared in confusion, no one will ever know. But the evidence made clear that Micah was awake and facing Ava when she ended his life. That fact would become the emotional breaking point of the entire trial. Eva began staging the scene immediately. She moved through the house with a focus that would later be described by investigators as disturbingly methodical. She took a kitchen knife and sliced the mesh of a window screen near the back door, creating what she intended to look like a forced entry point. She overturned 2 drawers in the kitchen and scattered a few items on the floor. She removed a small amount of jewelry from Claire's dresser and placed it in the trash bag she would later carry outside. But she took too little. The staging was built on a teenager's understanding of what a burglary looks like. drawn from television and fragments of her father's professional conversations, and it was incomplete in ways that real criminals would not have left behind. She then removed her hoodie, which had been contaminated during the shootings, placed it in the washing machine, and started a cycle using cold water and extra detergent. She wiped surfaces she thought she had touched. She placed the weapon in a bag, and at 3:12 in the morning, she walked out the side door into the yard, carrying the trash bag, past the drainage grate, and returned inside to wait. At 4:06 in the morning, Eva Mercer dialed emergency services. Her voice came through the line thin, unsteady, and calculated to sound like a child in crisis. She told the operator that men had broken into the house. She said they came for her father because he was a police officer. She said she hid in the laundry room and never saw their faces. She cried without tears. She gasped at the right intervals. She paused where a frightened child would pause and resumed where performance required her to continue. The operator dispatched units immediately, and within minutes the first responders arrived at the Mercer home. When they entered, they were met with the smell of gunpowder, cleaning detergent, and iron. One officer recognized Daniel Mercer before the body was even fully visible. Another stood in the kitchen looking at the sliced window screen and paused for half a second too long, the kind of pause that comes not from shock, but from instinct, from the feeling that something in the room is not grief, but theater. The scene was devastating. It was also wrong. And before the sun came up, that wrongness would begin to speak louder than anything Eva Mercer had rehearsed. When a police officer is killed, the response is never just procedural. It is personal. It travels through a department like an electrical charge, triggering reflexes that go deeper than training and further than protocol. And when the officer is someone like Daniel Mercer, a man respected not for his rank but for his consistency, a man who had spent 2 decades showing up on time, doing the work, mentoring younger officers, and never once asking for recognition, the response becomes something closer to a collective wound. Within an hour of the first dispatch call, the street outside the Mercer home was lined with patrol vehicles. Detectives arrived with jackets still unbuttoned. Forensic units pulled equipment from vans, while uniformed officers stood along the perimeter with faces that shifted between grief and rage. No one spoke loudly. No one needed to. Daniel Mercer was one of theirs, and the assumption that carried through every conversation and every early theory was simple and immediate. Someone had targeted a cop. Eva was treated as the sole surviving victim from the first moment she was seen. A paramedic wrapped a shock blanket around her shoulders and led her to the back of an ambulance, where she sat with her knees drawn up and her head slightly lowered. She trembled visibly. She answered questions in a whisper. She repeated the same phrase several times. "They came for Dad," and each time she said it, the officers nearby tightened their jaws and looked toward the house with the kind of fury that only comes from imagining someone you respect being ambushed in his own bed. Eva played the part of the terrified child with extraordinary precision. She leaned into every comforting gesture without initiating any of her own. She made eye contact at intervals that felt natural rather than rehearsed. And she cried exactly twice, once when asked if she had seen her mother, and once when a female officer asked about the boys. But neither time did actual tears fall. The emotion was suggested rather than produced, and in the chaos of those first hours, no one noticed the difference. The lead investigator assigned to the case was Captain Lena Ortiz, a 22-year veteran of the department who had known Daniel professionally for over a decade. Ortiz was not sentimental by nature. She respected Daniel, but she had spent too many years working violent crimes to let personal feelings distort an investigation. She arrived at the scene with the understanding that this case would carry unusual emotional weight for the department, and she made a decision in the first 10 minutes that would later define the trajectory of the entire investigation. She told her team that grief would not enter the evidence chain. They would work this case the same way they would work any other. Assumptions about retaliation, gang involvement, or case-related revenge would be tested, not adopted, and the surviving family member, regardless of age, would be treated as a witness whose account needed corroboration, not as a source of automatic truth. That decision did not make her popular in the first 24 hours, but it made her right. The home invasion narrative that Eva had constructed began to weaken almost immediately under the pressure of routine forensic examination. No neighbors reported hearing a vehicle arrive or depart during the window of the crime. No tire tracks were found on the street outside the Mercer property. No footprints appeared on the lawn, the porch, or the soft earth beneath the windows. The sliced window screen near the back door, which Eva had intended as the entry point for the imaginary intruders, showed no pry marks on the frame and no disturbance to the dust on the windowsill. The screen was cut, but the window itself had not been opened. It was a visual prop, not a functional point of entry. Inside the house, jewelry remained in plain sight on Claire's dresser. Daniel's service weapon was still holstered in its position beside the bed. A laptop sat undisturbed on the kitchen table. Nothing of real value had been taken, and the few items that had been moved were scattered in a pattern that looked more like set dressing than genuine ransacking. Eva's account of the night included a specific claim that would prove critically important. She told officers she had hidden in the laundry room from the moment she heard the first loud sound until she was certain the intruders had left. She said she stayed curled behind the dryer with her hands over her ears, too frightened to move, too afraid to call for help until silence returned. It was a compelling image, a child hiding in the dark while her family was destroyed around her, and it generated sympathy from every officer who heard it. But a crime scene technician working the hallway noticed something that did not fit the story. The washing machine in the laundry room was still warm. Its cycle had been completed recently, and no first responder had started it. If Eva had been hiding behind the dryer, frozen with fear from the first moment of violence, why had the washing machine been running? That question did not generate an answer immediately, but it generated attention. The physical evidence continued to accumulate in small, quiet ways that individually meant little but collectively began to form a pattern. A forensic technician moving through the house bagged every item of clothing that appeared recently worn, recently washed, or out of place. In the laundry hamper beside the machine, he found a hoodie that was slightly damp and carried a sharp chemical smell consistent with concentrated detergent. It was not a dramatic discovery. He did not hold it up or call across the room. He simply sealed it in an evidence bag, labeled it, and placed it with the other collected items. That hoodie would later become one of the most important objects in the entire case. Because under laboratory analysis it would reveal traces so small they were invisible to the human eye, but large enough to place the person who wore it within arm's reach of a fired weapon. Captain Ortiz stepped back into the kitchen after completing her second walkthrough of the house. She stood at the back door and looked again at the cut window screen. She had seen staged scenes before. She knew what they looked like, the way they tried too hard to tell a story, the way they arranged details with the logic of someone imagining a crime rather than committing one. She pulled on a fresh glove and ran her finger along the edge of the torn mesh. The metal fibers bent outward. From the inside, whoever had cut that screen had done so from within the house, pushing the blade through the mesh toward the yard rather than pulling it from outside. It was a small detail. It took less than 3 seconds to observe, but it changed the direction of the entire investigation. The protected child sitting in the ambulance outside, the girl everyone was trying to comfort and shelter and reassure, had just moved to the center of Lena Ortiz's attention. And once she was there, she would never leave. The autopsy results arrived 48 hours after the crime, and they rewrote the night in ways that made Eva Mercer's story impossible to sustain. The toxicology reports for both Daniel and Claire Mercer revealed elevated levels of a common sedative compound in their bloodstreams, a level significantly higher than what Claire's prescription alone could account for, and entirely unexplained in Daniel's case since he had no history of taking any such medication. The implication was devastating and specific. Someone had administered additional sedatives to both parents before the violence began. The killer had not faced a family in a state of alertness. The killer had made certain that the 2 adults most capable of resistance were chemically slowed, disoriented, and unable to respond with the speed that might have saved their lives or the lives of their children. It was not opportunism. It was sabotage carried out from within the home by someone who had access to the parents' evening routines and the knowledge of how to exploit them. No ballistic analysis confirmed that all 4 victims had been killed with the same weapon, Daniel Mercer's own backup pistol, the one stored in the lockbox on the top shelf of the bedroom closet. The weapon had not been found at the scene during the initial search, which initially supported the intruder theory, since fleeing criminals would logically take the weapon with them. But the type of firearm, the ammunition used, and the trajectory angles all pointed to a weapon that had been retrieved from inside the home, not brought in from outside. Whoever fired those shots had known where the weapon was stored, had known the lockbox code, and had moved through the house with the familiarity of someone who lived there. The intruder theory did not just weaken. It became structurally impossible. Every ballistic detail pointed inward, toward the family, toward the rooms, toward the girl who claimed she had been hiding behind the dryer the entire time. Blood pattern analysis became one of the most visually devastating elements of the investigation. The patterns in the master bedroom told a story that was precise and irreversible. Daniel's wound trajectory showed he had been shot while partially risen in bed, his body oriented toward the bedroom door, as if instinct had pulled him upright even through the fog of the sedatives. The spray angles on the headboard, the wall, and the bedding confirmed he was in a semi-reclined position at the moment of impact. Claire's patterns were different. She was closer to the edge of the mattress, her body angled not toward the door, but toward Daniel, consistent with a person reaching for a loved one rather than attempting to flee. She had not tried to save herself. She had tried to reach her husband. The forensic team noted this in clinical language, but the emotional weight of that detail carried far beyond the lab report. Even in the final disoriented seconds of her life, Claire's instinct had been to protect the person beside her. The boys' rooms told their own stories, each one more painful than the last. Owen's scene was almost peaceful in its stillness. No defensive posture, no signs of waking. The blood pattern was consistent with a single close-range event during deep sleep. He had not known. He had not suffered the terror of awareness. Micah's scene was different, and the difference would become the emotional center of gravity for the entire trial. The evidence indicated that Micah had shifted in his bed, turned toward the door, and was facing the entrance to his room at the moment of the final act. His blanket was partially displaced, suggesting movement, and the positioning of his body was consistent with a child who had woken and looked up. He saw who was standing in his doorway. He saw his sister. The forensic team processed the room in near silence. One technician who had worked violent crime scenes for over a decade asked to step outside and did not return for several minutes. The staged window screen was formally classified by the forensic team as an interior cut, confirming Captain Ortiz's initial observation. Fiber analysis of the mesh showed that the blade had been applied from inside the house, with pressure directed outward. The dust on the windowsill remained undisturbed, and no fingerprints from unknown individuals were found on the glass, the frame, or the surrounding wall. The entry point that Eva's story depended upon had never been used by anyone. It was a prop, a teenager's idea of what a break-in should look like, assembled with just enough detail to fool a first glance, but nowhere near enough to survive forensic scrutiny. Investigators also noted that the items scattered on the kitchen floor had been placed rather than thrown. The distribution was too even, the damage too symmetrical. It looked like a stage set dressed by someone who had never actually witnessed the chaos of a real burglary. The digital forensic team added another layer to the tightening case. Data recovery from Claire's phone revealed a draft text message that had been typed after the estimated time of death, but never sent. The message was addressed to Claire's sister and read simply, "Morning. Boys got up early again." It was casual, unremarkable, and completely normal, which was exactly the problem. Someone had picked up Claire's phone after she was already gone and begun composing a message designed to simulate a routine morning, to push the perceived timeline of events forward and delay suspicion. The draft had been abandoned before sending, possibly because the killer was interrupted by the approach of dawn or the realization that the ruse was too fragile to sustain. But the existence of that unsent message told investigators something critical. Whoever did this was not acting in a frenzy. They were thinking about the next 12 hours. They were managing perception. The final piece of the forensic foundation arrived from the laboratory in a sealed envelope that Ortiz opened at her desk, while the rest of the department was still operating under the assumption that the case was a targeted assault on an officer. Inside the report was a fingerprint analysis from the ammunition tray within Daniel's lockbox. Several prints belonged to Daniel, as expected. One partial print on the underside of the tray, in a position consistent with someone lifting it to access the rounds beneath, did not belong to Daniel or Claire. It belonged to Eva Mercer. A 14-year-old's fingerprint inside a secured weapon storage container that she should never have been able to open. Ortiz read the result twice. Then she closed the folder, pressed her palm flat against the desk, and sat very still for a long time. The case had just changed forever. And the girl in the juvenile facility down the road, the one still wrapped in the story of masked intruders and childhood terror, had no idea how much the truth had already said without her permission. Once Eva Mercer shifted in the investigation from protected witness to primary suspect, the forensic team turned their full attention to the digital architecture of her life. And what they found there was not the impulsive trail of a child in crisis. It was a roadmap, a timeline of research, rehearsal, and preparation so deliberate that it erased any remaining possibility that the killings had been spontaneous, reactive, or driven by momentary rage. Eva had spent weeks building the intellectual framework for what she intended to do, and she had done it on devices she believed were beyond the reach of anyone who might care to look. She was wrong about that. She was wrong about almost everything she thought she understood about evidence and erasure. And the digital record she left behind would become the prosecution's most devastating instrument of proof. Her school-issued laptop contained a browser history that had been cleared multiple times but remained partially recoverable through cloud synchronization logs and cached server-side data. The searches were clinical in their specificity. She had queried the duration and onset time of crushed sedative tablets dissolved in liquid. She had researched whether gunshot residue could be removed through standard household laundering. She had searched detailed instructions for staging a residential break-in, it including the positioning of damaged entry points and the types of items a real intruder would take. And in what would become the single most referenced piece of digital evidence in the trial, she had typed a question that the prosecution would display on a courtroom screen in letters large enough for every juror to read, "Can a 14-year-old get death sentence for killing family?" She had asked the question weeks before the crime. She knew what she was planning. She knew the potential consequences. And she moved forward anyway because she believed the answer to that question was no. The forensic data team recovered a series of voice notes from a cloud backup linked to the second phone Daniel had confiscated. Eva had recorded these notes over a period of several weeks, and their content revealed a psychological portrait far removed from the obedient, well-mannered daughter the outside world believed her to be. In one recording, she spoke in a flat, unaffected tone about her father treating the house like a precinct, and her mother always choosing his rules over her freedom. In another, recorded approximately 10 days before the killings, she said a sentence that would be replayed in court multiple times. She said, "If they vanish, I get my life back." The phrasing was adolescent in its construction. The intent behind it was not. She did not say leave. She did not say divorce. She did not say move away. She said vanish. And the forensic psychologist who later reviewed the recordings noted that her vocal effect during that statement was calm, measured, and entirely free of the emotional distortion that typically accompanies expressions of genuine distress. Text message recovery added the emotional accelerant the case needed. Investigators obtained deleted thread fragments from a conversation between Eva and a school classmate conducted through a messaging application 2 days before the murders. In that exchange, Eva had written a single line that would generate more public outrage than almost any other piece of evidence in the case. She wrote, "By sunrise, this house won't own me anymore." She followed the message with a laughing emoji and then deleted the entire conversation. The classmate, who had interpreted the message at the time as dramatic teenage frustration, did not report it or respond with alarm. The deletion suggested Eva understood the weight of what she had written. The emoji suggested she did not care. That combination of awareness and indifference became the emotional signature of the prosecution's case. A 14-year-old girl laughing at the future she was building on the bodies of the people who raised her. Surveillance footage from external sources began to close the remaining gaps in the investigative timeline. Pharmacy security cameras captured Eva purchasing an over-the-counter sedative 3 days before the killings. She paid with cash. She wore a hat pulled low. She did not look at the camera. These were not the behaviors of a child making an innocent purchase. These were countermeasures, and while they were unsophisticated by adult criminal standards, they demonstrated a level of premeditated awareness that destroyed any future defense argument rooted in impulsive adolescent behavior. On a neighbor's motion-activated camera, the same device that had captured the 312 footage of Eva in the side yard also recorded her returning to the house without the trash bag she had carried out, confirming disposal. And a transit authority camera positioned near a drainage canal 2 blocks from the Mercer property captured a figure matching Eva's build and clothing tossing an object from a bridge into the water below shortly before dawn. Dive teams were dispatched to the canal within hours of the footage being reviewed. The water was shallow and murky, but the search area was narrow enough to yield results quickly. On the canal bed, wrapped in a dark undershirt that was later confirmed to belong to Daniel Mercer, investigators recovered the backup pistol used in all 4 killings. The shirt carried transfer blood consistent with a small wound on Eva's right hand, a split knuckle likely caused by the recoil of a weapon too large for her grip, or by contact with a hard surface during the frantic staging that followed. She had used her father's weapon. She had wrapped it in her father's clothing. She had carried it past her father's neighbors in the dark. And she had still left behind a microscopic trace of herself on the fabric. Every precaution she took was defeated by the one variable she could not control, the persistence of physical evidence. The arrest authorization was signed by a magistrate within hours of the dive recovery. Ortiz held the document in her hands and read it through twice before initiating the process. She did not look relieved. She did not feel satisfaction. She told a colleague later that the moment she read Eva Mercer's name on an arrest warrant alongside the word homicide was one of the worst moments of her career, not because the evidence was uncertain, but because it was overwhelming. Daniel Mercer had spent his professional life teaching younger officers how to recognize staged crime scenes. He had lectured on evidence tampering, false narratives, and the psychology of domestic perpetrators who disguise themselves as victims. His own daughter had absorbed those lessons. She had studied his methods. She had applied his knowledge, and she had still failed, not because she lacked intelligence, but because staged scenes fail for the same reason every time. They imitate logic, not life. Real grief is messy and unpredictable, and full of the kind of chaos that cannot be manufactured by someone standing calmly in a kitchen at 3 a.m, deciding which drawer to overturn next. Eva Mercer built a lie with her father's tools. But truth has tools of its own, and they do not require a combination code. Understanding Eva Mercer required more than evidence. It required excavation. The forensic case had already assembled the physical proof of what she had done: the searches, the sedatives, the weapon, the footage, the fingerprint. But the question that hung over the investigation like a second shadow was not how. It was why. What kind of mind at 14 years old could plan the elimination of an entire family with the patience and precision the evidence described? What architecture of thought allowed a child to move through the rooms of people who loved her and treat each one as an obstacle to be removed rather than a person to be mourned? The answer did not arrive as a single revelation. It arrived in fragments gathered from the people who had spent years watching Eva Mercer become someone none of them fully recognized. Teachers provided the public portrait. They described a student who was intelligent, well-spoken, and remarkably self-possessed in social settings. She could adjust her vocabulary, her tone, and her emotional register depending on who she was speaking to, shifting seamlessly between the casual language of her peers and the polished diction of adults without appearing to make an effort. One teacher recalled that Eva had a talent for reading rooms, for knowing exactly what a person wanted to hear and delivering it with a sincerity that felt completely genuine. Another said she had never met a 14-year-old who was so skilled at managing the impressions of adults. At the time, these observations were framed as compliments. In retrospect, every teacher who offered them recognized that what they had been praising was not maturity. It was mimicry. Eva had not learned how to feel the things other people felt. She had learned how to perform them convincingly enough to avoid scrutiny. Her peers told a different story, one that operated beneath the surface of the version adults were allowed to see. Close friends described a girl who could be magnetic, generous, and deeply attentive one day, and then cold, dismissive, and deliberately hurtful the next, without warning or provocation. She collected personal information about the people around her, not out of curiosity, but out of strategy. She remembered weaknesses. She cataloged embarrassments. And when she felt slighted, denied, or insufficiently respected, she used that information with surgical precision. One friend described an incident in which Eva publicly revealed another girl's private family situation during a group argument simply because the girl had disagreed with her in front of others. The cruelty was not impulsive. It was stored and deployed. And when the damage was done, Eva did not apologize. She simply moved on as if the incident had never happened, leaving the other girl devastated and confused about what she had done wrong. Claire Mercer's private counseling journal, recovered from a drawer in her home office, offered the most painful perspective of all. Claire had written about Eva not as a parent in fear, but as a professional in quiet alarm. She noted instances of flat emotional affect following events that should have produced distress. She described Eva's response to a classmate's injury as inappropriately detached. She wrote about lies that served no functional purpose, lies told even when the truth would have been easier and carried no consequence, as if deception were not a strategy but a reflex. One entry, dated several months before the killings, contained a line that would later be read aloud in court. Claire wrote, "I keep waiting for her to feel something real, and I don't know how to make that happen without making her feel like I think something is wrong with her." It was the sentence of a mother trying to hold two truths at once, that her daughter might be deeply troubled, and that naming that trouble might push her further away. Claire chose patience. She chose hope, and the cost of that choice was more than any mother should ever have to pay. Daniel's role in the family dynamic deepened the tragedy in a different direction. He was a man trained to identify threat, to read body language, to sense deception across interrogation tables and crime scenes. He had spent decades surrounded by people who lied for a living, and he had developed instincts that were sharp enough to have earned commendations from the department. But those instincts operated within a professional framework that did not translate cleanly into the domestic sphere. At home, he saw Ava's behavior through the lens of adolescence rather than pathology. The lying was teenage rebellion. The emotional coldness was a phase. The secret phone and the older man were problems that structure and discipline could correct. He recognized the warning signs. He simply interpreted them through the wrong framework. He saw his daughter as a child in trouble. He did not see her as a threat, and that misreading cost him everything, because by the time he understood the difference, he was already sedated in his own bed with his own weapon in his daughter's hands. In juvenile detention, Ava continued to reveal herself in ways that no defense team could fully contain. She complained about the quality of food more often than she mentioned her family. She asked a detention nurse whether her father's pension benefits would transfer to surviving relatives, a question that carried no emotional weight in her voice, but enormous forensic weight in the context of the case. She asked a staff member whether her brothers had died instantly, not from a place of grief, not with tears or trembling, with the flat curiosity of someone reviewing outcomes. When a counselor attempted to engage her in a discussion about loss, she responded with a sentence that the counselor later repeated in a deposition. "I don't miss the house, I miss the space." The counselor said she was not sure whether Eva meant physical space or psychological space. She was not sure Eva knew the difference. Yet the chapter of Eva's story that made the case so difficult for the public to process was not the evidence of calculation. It was the evidence of youth. She was still 14. Her handwriting was still rounded and uneven. Or her room at the Mercer house still contained school books, friendship bracelets, and cheap costume jewelry bought with allowance money. She still had braces. She still bit her nails. She still looked, in every visible and measurable way, like a child. And that contradiction was the engine of the case's emotional power, because the audience wanted a monster they could separate from the world they knew. They wanted someone who looked like evil, who carried it visibly, who could be identified and contained by appearance alone. Instead, they got a girl who looked like every other girl in every other school in every other quiet neighborhood. And that was the most frightening thing of all. Captain Ortiz prepared for the interrogation with the same methodical discipline she had applied to every stage of the investigation. She chose compassion as her opening strategy, not because she felt it, but because she understood that Ava's psychological architecture responded to control, and the fastest way to disrupt a controller is to offer them something they do not expect. She would begin with warmth. She would give Ava room to speak. She would let the silence do its work, and she would wait for the moment when performance cracked and the real Ava stepped forward. Outside the interrogation room, a detective placed a single item on the table, a printed still frame from the 312 camera footage, enlarged to full-page size, showing Ava in the side yard with the trash bag in her hand. It sat there face up, waiting, like a question that already knew its answer. Shieva entered the interrogation room the way a child enters a guidance counselor's office after being called out of class for something she does not believe is serious. She was small, pale, and soft-voiced. Her eyes moved around the room once, registering the camera, the mirror, the table, and the single printed photograph lying face down near the far edge. She sat in the metal chair and folded her hands in her lap and asked, with what sounded like genuine confusion, whether she would be able to go home after this. The question was crafted to establish a frame. She was the child. She was the victim. She had been called here because adults were being thorough, not because she was suspected of anything. It was the same frame she had maintained since the night of the killings, and she delivered it with the same quiet, an almost fragile composure that had earned her a blanket, an ambulance seat, and the sympathy of an entire police department. Captain Ortiz began gently. She spoke in a low, calm voice that carried no accusation and no urgency. She asked Ava how she was sleeping. She asked whether the food at the facility was acceptable. She asked whether anyone had been unkind to her. She gave Ava space to talk, and Ava filled that space carefully, offering small details about her discomfort, her loneliness, her confusion about why things were taking so long. She was cooperative in the way that innocent people are expected to be, answering questions without resistance, but also without volunteering anything that extended beyond the scope of what was asked. For the first several minutes, the conversation felt like a welfare check rather than an interrogation. Ortiz let it feel that way. She understood that the most dangerous thing she could do was push too early, because Ava would retreat behind the child persona, and the conversation would end before it produced anything useful. So she waited. She listened. And she watched. When Ortiz asked Ava to walk through the night one more time, Ava complied with impressive consistency. Her account matched her original statement almost word for word. The same timeline, the same hiding spot, the same phrasing about masked men and her father being targeted because of his work. Real trauma tends to distort memory in characteristic ways. Survivors of violent events typically recall fragments, sensory details, and emotional impressions rather than structured chronological narratives. Should their stories shift slightly with each retelling, not because they are lying, but because traumatic memory does not store itself in neat sequences. Ava's story arrived every time in the same order, with the same words and the same emotional beats placed at the same intervals. It was not a memory. It was a script. and Ortiz recognized the difference because she had heard both hundreds of times over a career built on separating one from the other. The first disruption came when Ortiz introduced the washing machine. She did not frame it as an accusation. She framed it as a puzzle, something she needed help understanding. She said the forensic team had noted that the washing machine was still warm when first responders entered the house, and she asked Eva whether she had started a load of laundry at any point during the night. Eva's reaction was subtle but critical. She did not break down. She did not panic. She stiffened. Her shoulders pulled back half an inch, and her jaw tightened in a way that communicated not fear, but irritation. She paused longer than she had paused for any previous question, and then said she did not remember. Ortiz moved to the window screen next, mentioning in the same casual tone that the forensic team had found the cut was made from inside the house rather than outside. Eva corrected a detail. She said the screen near the back door was already damaged before that night, that it had been torn during a storm weeks earlier. The correction was specific, confident, and entirely unrequested. An innocent witness would not have cared about the precise condition of a window screen during a conversation about the worst night of her life. Eva cared because the screen was her creation and someone was describing it incorrectly. Then Ortiz turned the printed photograph face up. The image showed Eva in the side yard at 3:12 in the morning, captured by the neighbor's camera in a single clear frame, holding a dark bag and walking toward the drainage grate with no urgency and no distress visible in her posture. Eva glanced at the photograph once and looked away too quickly. She did not ask what it showed. She did not lean forward to examine it. She looked away the way a person looks away from something they already know the content of. Ortiz said nothing. She let the silence fill the room and watched Eva calculate. After several seconds that felt much longer, Eva asked whether people could be mistaken by what she called grainy cameras. It was the first time in the entire interrogation that she acknowledged the footage mattered. She did not say the image was not her. She did not say she had never been in the yard. She questioned the reliability of the medium itself, which was a defensive strategy, not a denial. The next layer arrived in the form of gunshot residue findings. Ortiz explained calmly that trace analysis had identified residue on items recovered from the laundry hamper consistent with recent discharge of a firearm. Eva shifted in her seat and adopted a new posture, leaning slightly forward with her arms crossed on the table. The frightened child was gone. The defensive teenager had arrived. She said, "So what if I touched my father's things? I lived there." It was the first sentence she had spoken in the interrogation that carried weight, and it carried weight because it conceded proximity. She was no longer claiming complete separation from the weapon or the evidence. She was arguing that proximity was explainable, but no one had asked her to explain proximity. They had asked her about residue, and by jumping to the defensive contact, she had moved ahead of the question in a way that only someone with knowledge of the crime would need to. The final confrontation was precise and devastating. An investigator slid a printed screenshot across the table. On it was the search query Eva had typed into her school laptop weeks before the killings. Can a 14-year-old get death sentence for killing family? Eva looked at the printout and went very still. Not the stillness of shock, not the stillness of someone seeing something unexpected. the stillness of a person whose internal calculations have just been interrupted by a variable they did not account for. She sat motionless for a long time. When she finally spoke, she did not deny the search. She did not explain it as research for a school project or morbid curiosity. She asked a question that would define her courtroom arc and follow her into sentencing. She asked, "Does being 14 still count for anything?" The question was not a plea for help. It was a strategic inquiry. She wanted to know whether the one advantage she believed she still held, her age, was still functional. She was not scared. She was recalibrating. Ava asked for a lawyer. The chair scraped against the floor as she pushed back from the table. She stood without looking at the photograph or the search printout again. An officer opened the door, and she walked through it without turning around. Ortiz remained seated, her hands flat on the table, staring at the place where Ava had been sitting. The reflection of the 312 photograph floated faintly in the glass partition between the interrogation room and the observation corridor. Ortiz later told a colleague that the most disturbing moment of the interrogation was not the search history or the residue or the footage. It was the question, does being 14 still count for anything? Because it revealed that Eva's first concern was never whether they knew what she had done. It was whether age would protect her from the consequences. She was not a child caught in a lie. She was a strategist watching her last defense come under threat. The door closed behind her. The room stayed silent. And the investigation entered its final phase with a single, irreversible conclusion. Eva Mercer had not been hiding in the laundry room that night. She had been running the house. Inspector Daniel Mercer was buried on a Thursday morning under a sky so clear it felt like an insult. The ceremony was conducted with full departmental honors, the kind of formal tribute reserved for officers who fall in the line of duty. And while Daniel had technically been off duty and in his own bed when he was killed, no one in the department argued the distinction. He had served for 22 years. He had trained dozens of officers. He had never once filed a complaint, requested a transfer, or taken a sick day he did not need. And he had been murdered in the place where he should have been safest, by the person he should have been able to trust the most. Uniformed officers lined the road from the funeral home to the cemetery, standing at attention in rows so straight they looked like they had been drawn with a ruler. The honor guard folded the flag with mechanical precision and presented it to Claire's father because there was no surviving spouse to receive it. The sound of taps played from a single trumpet carried across the cemetery and settled over the crowd like a weight that would not lift. Claire's family occupied the front row in a state of collective devastation that was visible from the last seat. Her sister sat with both hands gripping the armrests of her chair as if letting go would mean falling through the earth. Her father, a retired teacher in his 70s, stared at the casket with an expression that went beyond grief into something closer to incomprehension. He had lost his daughter, his son-in-law, and both of his grandsons in a single night. 4 people. 4 funerals arranged in the span of one impossible week. The boys were buried beside their mother in smaller caskets that made several attendees look away because the size of a casket should never tell you the age of the person inside. Owen's classmates had written letters that were placed inside. Micah's teacher had brought the last drawing he made at school, a crayon picture of his family standing in front of their house with the sun overhead and the word home written in uneven letters across the top. That drawing would later appear in court as an exhibit, not as evidence, as testimony to the innocence that had been taken. Ava was permitted to attend the funeral under guard before formal charges were publicly announced. The decision was controversial within the department, but legally required under the jurisdiction's Juvenile Protection Guidelines, which granted surviving minors the right to attend immediate family services unless a direct security threat could be demonstrated. She arrived in a dark dress with her hair down and her eyes lowered. She looked small and broken in exactly the way a 14-year-old girl should look at the funeral of her parents and brothers. Relatives who did not yet know the direction of the investigation embraced her. An aunt held her for nearly a minute. A family friend whispered that she was brave. Ava accepted every gesture with the kind of quiet, trembling composure that people interpret as strength in the face of unimaginable loss. She pressed her face against her grandmother's shoulder. She held a tissue she never used. And for those few hours, the illusion held. She was still the surviving child. She was still the one who needed protection. The lie walked among the grief, and no one stopped it. Hours later, in a corridor of the juvenile detention facility where Ava had been housed since the investigation shifted focus, officers executed the arrest in a controlled environment away from public view. The decision to arrest outside the presence of media was made by Captain Ortiz, who understood that the spectacle of a 14-year-old in handcuffs would generate a public reaction that could compromise the integrity of subsequent proceedings. But the media found her anyway. A photograph taken through a facility window by a freelance journalist captured Ava being led between two officers, her wrists in restraints that looked disproportionately large against her arms, her face turned slightly toward the camera with an expression that was neither grief nor defiance, but something closer to annoyance. That photograph was published within the hour, and the city fractured. A police officer's daughter, 14 years old, 4 family members gone. The headlines wrote themselves because the story felt too extreme to be real and too documented to be denied. The prosecution formally announced charges of aggravated multiple homicide, the murder of a law enforcement officer within his own residence, evidence of premeditated staging, and obstruction through the destruction of physical evidence. Because the jurisdiction's capital statutes permitted death-eligible sentencing for offenders aged 14 and older in cases involving the planned killing of 3 or more individuals, including a protected class victim, the specter of the ultimate sentence entered the case as a legal possibility. That legal threshold sent a shock wave through the public discourse that split neatly along a fault line no one could bridge. On one side stood the people who believed that the nature of the crime, the planning, the drugging, the staging, and the killing of 2 sleeping children demanded the most severe response the law could produce, regardless of the defendant's age. On the other stood those who argued that no civilized legal system should be permitted to execute a child, no matter what that child had done. Both sides were loud. Both sides were certain, and both sides were about to discover that certainty provides no comfort when the facts refuse to simplify. A detention officer assigned to Eva's unit reported a detail that leaked to the press and became one of the most discussed moments in the pretrial period. After Eva was informed that capital charges were being considered, the officer expected tears, collapse, panic, or the kind of visceral fear that even hardened adult defendants display when confronted with the possibility of the ultimate sentence. Instead, Eva asked for juice. She leaned back in her chair, looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then said to no one in particular, "They always overreact first." The officer recorded the statement in her shift log. When it was later reported in the media, it generated a wave of public fury so intense that the judge was forced to issue a gag order restricting pretrial commentary from facility staff. The line was not evidence, it was not admissible, but it was real. And it told the public something that the evidence had already told the investigators. Eva Mercer did not believe the system would touch her. She believed her age was a wall no sentence could climb. Claire's father saw the arrest photograph on the evening news. He was sitting alone in the living room of his home, surrounded by sympathy cards he had not opened, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour earlier. When Eva's face appeared on the screen, flanked by officers, framed by the institutional corridor, reduced to a still image frozen between two uniformed arms, he pressed his hand against the television screen. His palm covered her face. He held it there for a long time, and then he said, in a voice so quiet that only the empty room heard it, "That child sat at my table. He had served her birthday cake. He had read her bedtime stories. He had driven her to school on mornings when Daniel was working early shifts. He had believed, with the full weight of a grandfather's love, that she was his. Now she was something else. She was a defendant. She was a headline. She was the answer to a question no family should ever have to ask. And the image of her face beneath his trembling hand, frozen between grief and disbelief, became the emotional frame that would carry the story into trial. The defense team began building their case exactly where the public expected them to. Youth, neuroscience, the documented reality that the adolescent brain is not fully developed in the regions responsible for impulse control, consequence evaluation, and long-term decision-making. They retained experts in developmental psychology and juvenile behavior who were prepared to testify that a 14-year-old, regardless of intelligence or planning ability, cannot be held to the same standard of moral culpability as an adult. The prefrontal cortex is still forming. The capacity for abstract empathy is still emerging. The line between fantasy and consequence is still blurred in ways that adult minds have long since resolved. This was not a fringe argument. It was grounded in decades of peer-reviewed research and had been used successfully in courtrooms around the world to argue against the most severe sentences for juvenile offenders. The defense did not claim the killings did not happen. They claimed that the mind behind the killings was still, by every measurable biological standard, a child's mind operating under pressures no child should be expected to navigate alone. The prosecution answered not with abstract philosophy, but with evidence. The sedatives purchased days in advance. The search history demonstrating awareness of consequences and legal exposure. The staged crime scene designed to misdirect trained investigators. The washing of contaminated clothing. The false emergency call calibrated to sound like a child in crisis. the disposal of the weapon in a location selected for its inaccessibility, the draft text message typed on a dead woman's phone to simulate a normal morning. Each element was presented not as a moment of impulse, but as a link in a chain. And each link demonstrated a capacity for sustained, sequential, outcome-oriented planning that no developmental argument could fully dissolve. The prosecution did not argue that Ava was an adult. They argued that she was calculating enough, and in a jurisdiction where the law defined capital eligibility not by age alone, but by the demonstrated nature of the offense, that argument carried the force of statute. Leon Voss, the older man whose messages had first alerted Daniel to the danger in Eva's secret life, was investigated exhaustively during the pre-trial period. He was located, arrested on unrelated charges, and questioned about his relationship with Eva. What emerged was a figure who was predatory, manipulative, and morally repugnant, but not a mastermind. Voss had groomed Eva over a period of weeks, telling her she was special, that her parents were controllers, that the world owed her more than a police officer's salary could provide. He fed her resentment and inflated her sense of entitlement. But he did not order the killings. He did not participate in the planning. He did not know they were going to happen. In fact, much of the fantasy relationship Ava had described to her classmates had been sustained by her own exaggeration. She had invented intimacy where there was only flattery. She had constructed a rescue narrative in which Voss was the liberator and her family was the prison. He was a catalyst, not an architect. And the defense team's hope of shifting blame toward an adult manipulator collapsed when it became clear that the plan, from sedatives to staging to disposal, was entirely Eva's own. Inside the juvenile detention facility, our Ava continued to produce moments that escaped the containment of legal strategy and entered the public record through depositions, staff testimony, and leaked observations. She complained about boredom with a frequency that struck facility counselors as deeply unusual for a child facing the charges she was facing. She asked detailed questions about the Mercer family home, whether it would be sold, who would manage the estate, whether personal belongings would be distributed or sealed. She made a comment to a facility cook that became one of the trial's most referenced secondary details. She said prison food was worse than funerals. The cook reported it. A guard corroborated it, and although the statement was never entered as evidence, it circulated in the media and solidified the public perception of Eva as someone for whom the death of her family was an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. The psychological experts retained by both sides produced assessments that diverged sharply and gave the case its moral complexity. The prosecution's expert, a forensic psychologist with extensive experience in juvenile violent offenders, identified multiple indicators of conduct disorder in Eva's history. Shallow emotional affect, grandiose self-perception, chronic deceptiveness, absence of guilt or remorse following harmful actions, and a pattern of manipulating others for personal advantage. He stopped short of applying a formal personality disorder diagnosis given her age, but he stated clearly that the behavioral constellation he observed was consistent with an individual who understood the difference between right and wrong and chose to disregard it because other people's suffering did not register as meaningful to her. The defense's expert, equally credentialed, warned against building certainty around the personality of a 14-year-old. She argued that adolescence is a period of identity instability, that traits observed at 14 may not persist into adulthood, and that condemning a child to the most severe punishment based on a personality still in formation was both scientifically premature and morally dangerous. The jury would eventually have to decide which expert they believed. But first they would have to sit in the courtroom and look at Ava's face and try to reconcile a child's features with a killer's record. The competency hearing was brief but pivotal. The judge reviewed the psychological evaluations, heard testimony from both experts, examined Ava's academic records and facility behavior reports, and asked her a series of direct questions designed to assess whether she understood the charges against her, the role of each participant in the trial, and the potential consequences of conviction. Ava answered every question correctly, calmly, and without hesitation. She understood what a jury was. She understood what a prosecutor did. She understood what a guilty verdict meant. And she understood with clarity that the judge noted for the record what a death sentence meant. She was ruled competent to stand trial. Under local statute, she was eligible to face adult sentencing if convicted. The courtroom reacted in opposing directions. Some exhaled with relief that the system would function as designed. Others lowered their heads in disbelief that a child could be processed through the same machinery that handled adults who had lived 3 times as long and understood the world 3 times as deeply. Ava was led out of the competency hearing in handcuffs that were, once again, visibly too large for her wrists. The metal sat loose against her skin and shifted when she moved. She walked between 2 officers toward the corridor door, and just before she passed through it, she glanced back over her shoulder at the press gallery. The look she gave them was not fear. It was not sorrow. It was annoyance, a flicker of irritation that all of these people were watching her as if she were a spectacle rather than a person who deserved to control the narrative of her own story. The cuffs clinked against each other as the door opened. No one in the room forgot the sound. It was too small for the crime, and it was too loud for the silence that followed. The trial opened on a morning that felt heavier than any weather could explain. The courtroom was full before the doors were officially unsealed, and the line of people who had not secured seats stretched down the corridor and around the corner into the building's main lobby. Journalists occupied an entire row of the gallery. Family members of the victims were seated in a reserved section near the front, separated from the general public by a low wooden partition that seemed entirely inadequate for the emotional distance between those who had lost everything and those who had come to watch. Officers in dress uniforms stood at intervals along the walls, and their presence served a dual purpose: security and tribute. Daniel Mercer's photograph, framed and draped with a thin black ribbon, sat on a small table near the prosecution's side of the courtroom. It was not an official exhibit. It was a reminder. And every person in that room understood what it meant. The prosecution's opening statement was built on contrast. The lead prosecutor stood before the jury and gestured toward a display board containing 4 family photographs. Daniel in uniform, Claire at a school event, Owen holding a toy badge, T and Micah laughing with cake frosting on his chin. He told the jury that the defendant, the girl seated behind the defense table, had been loved by every person in those photographs. She had been housed, educated, clothed, fed, counseled, and protected by two parents who gave her everything they could and asked for nothing in return except that she follow the rules of a household designed to keep her safe. Then he pointed to a second display. The search history, the pharmacy footage, the 312 camera still, and the toxicology summary. He said this case was not about whether a child can commit violence. Every jurisdiction in the world had answered that question. This case was about whether a child can plan, prepare, execute, and conceal the total destruction of her own family and then sit in an ambulance and pretend to be the victim. The evidence, he said, would answer that question with a clarity no argument could dissolve. The defense responded with the only weapon they had left: Eva's face. The defense attorney stood beside his client and placed one hand on her shoulder and asked the jury to look at her. He said she was 14 years old. He said she weighed less than 100 pounds. He said her hands were too small to properly grip the weapon she was accused of firing. He said the state was asking 12 adults to look at a child and declare her beyond redemption, beyond rehabilitation, all beyond the possibility that the next 10 or 20 or 30 years of brain development could transform her into someone capable of understanding the full weight of what she had done. He did not deny the evidence. He could not. But he reframed the question. He said this trial was not just about what happened in the Mercer house. It was about whether the justice system was willing to call a 14-year-old irredeemable forever. The word forever hung in the courtroom air, like something physical. Several jurors shifted in their seats. Ava did not. Ava's courtroom behavior became a secondary narrative that ran beneath the testimony like an undercurrent. She sat too comfortably. She leaned toward her attorney and whispered during moments when graphic details were being described, not with the urgency of someone hearing painful truths about their family, but with the casual posture of someone exchanging commentary about something unrelated. When Claire's final voicemail to her sister was played through the courtroom speakers, a message recorded 2 days before the murders, in which Claire said she was worried about Eva, but believed things would get better with time and patience. Ava dropped her gaze to the table. But a court observer seated nearby noted that her eyes were not closed in grief. They were open, focused on the wood grain of the table, with an expression that looked more like irritation than anguish. The room was crying. Ava was enduring, and the difference was visible to everyone who cared to look. Daniel's colleagues testified first. One officer who had worked with Daniel for 11 years described the scene he encountered when he entered the Mercer bedroom. He said he had processed dozens of violent crime scenes in his career and had trained himself to approach each one with professional detachment. But when he saw Daniel in the bed, in the room where he should have been safest, wearing the same type of undershirt he wore to department barbecues, lying in a position that suggested he had tried to rise and protect his family even through the sedatives, the officer had to excuse himself for 3 minutes. He said the hardest part was not the blood. It was the normalcy, the water glass on the nightstand, the alarm clock set for 5:15, the boots lined up beneath the hallway bench. Everything in that house said life was continuing. Everything in that bedroom said it had stopped. Another officer described Owen's room and mentioned the detail that would become one of the trial's most emotionally devastating images. Owen's toy police cruiser was on its side beside the hallway wall, apparently knocked over during the events of the night. It was a cheap plastic toy, the kind sold in gas stations, with a tiny badge sticker on the door and wheels that barely turned. But in the context of a boy who had dreamed of becoming a police officer like his father, a boy who had worn a plastic badge to school and narrated imaginary chases in his bedroom, that overturned toy became a symbol of everything the crime had destroyed. The officer did not cry when he described it. His voice simply stopped for a moment, and the silence carried more weight than any words could have. When he resumed, he said Owen was still in his sleeping position. He looked peaceful. He looked like a boy who expected to wake up in the morning and find his cruiser waiting for him on the floor. Claire's sister delivered the empathy beat that the trial needed. She took the witness stand and spoke in a voice that was steady but thin, the kind of steadiness that comes not from calm, but from the knowledge that breaking down completely would mean being unable to say the things she had come to say. She told the court that Claire had spent her entire professional life helping other people's children. She sat with frightened kids. She talked to angry teenagers. She held the hands of parents who did not know how to reach their own sons and daughters. And she did all of that while quietly carrying the fear that her own daughter was becoming someone she could not reach. Claire never said the word dangerous. She never said the word afraid. She said worried. She said confused. She said hopeful. Because Claire believed that love, patience, and time could bring any child back from whatever edge they had walked toward. Her voice broke only once when she said that Claire died reaching for Daniel, not running from Eva. That single sentence moved through the courtroom like a wave that no one could stop and no one wanted to. The side yard footage was played for the jury in its entirety, and then it was played again, frame by frame, with timestamps overlaid on the bottom of the screen. The courtroom watched in absolute silence as the image materialized on the display. 3:12 in the morning, the Mercer side gate opening from the inside. Eva stepping into the yard in dark clothing, carrying a trash bag in her right hand, walking with a pace that could only be described as deliberate, not running, not looking over her shoulder, not displaying any of the urgency or terror that a person fleeing from intruders would exhibit. She moved toward the drainage grate, paused for a moment that lasted approximately 4 seconds on the footage, and then continued along the yard perimeter before re-entering the house through the same side door. She closed the gate behind her with one hand, carefully enough that the latch engaged without sound. There were no masked men in the footage, no getaway vehicles, no accomplices. There was only Eva, alone, moving through her own yard in the middle of the night, with the confidence of someone who believed no one was watching. The intruder story did not just weaken, it died on that screen, and every juror saw the moment it stopped breathing. The forensic analysts followed the footage with the physical evidence that explained what the camera could not show. The hoodie recovered from the laundry hamper was presented along with the laboratory analysis that had detected microscopic backspatter on its fibers. The analyst explained that backspatter consists of extremely fine biological material that travels backward from a point of impact toward the source of the force. Its presence on the hoodie meant that the person wearing it had been within close range of at least one gunshot event. The washing cycle had removed visible traces, but had failed to eliminate the microscopic particles embedded in the fabric's weave. Eva had cleaned the hoodie. She had used extra detergent. She had started the machine before the 911 call. And none of it was enough. The material was too small to see, too deeply embedded to wash away, and too scientifically certain to argue with. The defense's cross-examination attempted to challenge the reliability of microtrace analysis, but the analyst's credentials and methodology held under pressure, and the jurors were left with a simple, devastating conclusion. Eva was wearing that hoodie when the weapon was fired. The toxicology evidence arrived next and delivered the betrayal beat that struck the jury hardest. The forensic toxicologist explained that both Daniel and Claire had elevated levels of a sedative compound that, in Daniel's case, had no legitimate medical explanation. He had no prescription. He had no history of voluntary use. The only plausible route of administration was ingestion, likely dissolved in a liquid consumed shortly before sleep. Claire's levels were elevated beyond her normal dosage by a margin consistent with external supplementation. The implication was clinical in the expert's language, but visceral in its meaning. The killer had not confronted a family prepared to fight. The killer had chemically weakened the two people most capable of resistance before picking up the weapon. It was not a fair fight. It was not even a fight. It was the deliberate disabling of two parents so that their children could be reached without interference. The jury listened to the toxicologist's calm, measured explanation, and several of them stopped writing notes. They just sat there. The pen in one juror's hand hung motionless above the page. The digital forensic examiner transformed the case into a timeline so precise and interconnected that the defense could not dissolve any single element without the others closing the gap. He presented the search history with dates and timestamps. He showed the pharmacy camera footage synced to the date of the sedative search. He displayed the deleted voice notes alongside the text messages to the classmate. He mapped location data from Eva's devices showing she was at home during every critical preparation point. He overlaid the cloud backup data with the draft text message typed on Claire's phone after the estimated time of death. Each element was projected on the courtroom screen and linked to the next, with connecting timestamps until the entire wall of evidence formed a single, continuous narrative that began weeks before the murders and ended with the 911 call at 4:06 in the morning. It was not one clue. It was not one mistake. It was a system, and the system told the story of a mind that had decided, prepared, executed, and concealed, all while living in the same house, eating at the same table, and kissing the same people. Good night. The 911 recording was played with audio enhancement that isolated layers of background sound beneath Eva's voice. The operator's questions and Eva's responses were presented alongside the analyst's annotations identifying specific ambient elements. Beneath Eva's thin, controlled panic, beneath the scripted trembling and the rehearsed gasps, the analyst identified a consistent mechanical hum that matched the frequency signature of the Mercer household's washing machine during an active spin cycle. The machine was still running when she made the call. She had not yet finished cleaning the evidence from her clothing when she picked up the phone and began performing the role of a terrified child for the emergency operator. That detail destroyed the last fragment of the defense's timeline argument. Ava had not hidden in the laundry room paralyzed with fear while intruders moved through the house. She had started a wash cycle to clean herself and then stood in that same room and called for help as if she were the victim. The courtroom was silent for a long time after the recording ended. The silence was not absence. It was wait. A classmate was called to the stand to verify the text message. She was young, nervous, and clearly uncomfortable with the gravity of where she was sitting and why. She confirmed that she had received the message from Ava 2 days before the killings. She read it aloud when asked, "By sunrise, this house won't own me anymore." She confirmed the laughing emoji that followed. She said at the time she thought Ava was being dramatic, the way teenagers are dramatic, and that she had not responded because she did not know what to say. When the prosecutor displayed the screenshot on the courtroom screen, the jurors could see the emoji clearly. It was small, it was round, it was yellow, and it sat at the end of a sentence that amounted to a declaration of intent to destroy a family. That tiny digital symbol, designed for casual amusement, landed in the courtroom harder than any word the prosecutor had spoken. Because it proved that Ava had not only planned what she was about to do, she had found it funny. The final piece of evidence in the prosecution's presentation was not a test result or a digital record. It was an object. The prosecutor held up a sealed evidence bag containing a small blanket, faded, worn soft at the edges, too small for the child who had used it. It was Micah's blanket, the blanket he folded beside his pillow every night, the blanket he pulled against his chest when the house made sounds he did not recognize. Forensic records showed that when the backup pistol was recovered from the drainage canal, it had been wrapped not only in Daniel's undershirt, but also in this blanket. Ava had taken her youngest brother's blanket from his room after ending his life and used it to cushion the weapon during transport and disposal. She had wrapped the instrument that destroyed her family in the comfort object of the child who had trusted her most. The prosecutor placed the evidence bag gently on the table and said nothing for 5 full seconds. Defense counsel did not object. The jury stared. And somewhere in the gallery, someone let out a sound that was not a word, but was understood by every person in the room as the sound of a heart folding in on itself. The defense advanced its strongest emotional argument during the motive phase of the trial. And it was an argument designed not to acquit, but to mitigate. The defense attorney stood before the jury and constructed a picture of a household defined by surveillance and restriction. Daniel Mercer was a police officer who brought his professional instincts home. He monitored his daughter's movements. He controlled her access to technology. He enforced rules with the same firmness he applied to subordinates at work. Claire, despite her warmth, deferred to Daniel on matters of discipline and never challenged his decisions in front of the children. Ava, the defense argued, grew up in an environment where love and control were indistinguishable, where structure felt like suffocation, and where the normal adolescent need for autonomy was treated as a threat to be neutralized. The defense did not use the word abuse. They did not need to. They implied a psychological cage and asked the jury to consider what a 14-year-old might do when she believed every door was locked from the outside. The prosecution dismantled that narrative with the same methodical precision it had applied to the physical evidence. School records showed Ava had friends, participated in extracurricular activities, and was not isolated from peers. Therapy notes from a brief counseling period showed standard parent-child conflict, not the kind of escalating coercive control that characterizes genuinely abusive households. Relatives testified that Daniel was firm but affectionate, that he attended school events, coached Little League, and took the family on annual vacations. Claire's sister said the Mercer household had tension, as all families do. But it was the tension of people trying to do the right thing under imperfect circumstances, not the tension of a household hiding violence behind closed doors. The family was flawed. It was not monstrous, and the distance between discipline and the kind of threat that might justify defensive annihilation was vast, unbridgeable, and unmistakable to anyone who examined the evidence without the distortion of advocacy. A secondary motive surfaced during the prosecution's rebuttal that added a layer of calculation to an already damning portrait. Eva's search history included queries about inheritance law, guardianship transfers, and whether a surviving minor could remain in a family residence under the custody of a non-parental relative. She had not only planned the elimination of her family, she had planned the aftermath. She had envisioned a version of her life that continued past the crime, a version in which she remained in the house, lived under the lighter supervision of a distant relative, and enjoyed the financial residue of the lives she had ended. She was not planning escape. She was planning succession. And that distinction mattered because it revealed the architecture of her motive with devastating clarity. She did not want to run from her family. She wanted to replace them as the central authority of her own existence. A school friend provided a piece of testimony that arrived in the trial like a door slamming shut on any remaining ambiguity about the nature of Eva's thinking. The friend recalled a conversation from several months before the killings in which Ava had remarked, during what had seemed like a casual exchange about a television crime drama, that poisoning someone would be cleaner than other methods because it left less mess and was harder to trace. The friend had laughed at the time, interpreting it as the kind of dark, edgy commentary that teenagers sometimes offer when they are trying to seem provocative. She did not report it. She did not think about it again until after the arrest. But in the context of the trial, the remark functioned as something far more significant than teenage bravado. It was rehearsal. Ava had spoken the thought aloud to test its weight in the air, to see whether the words felt real when they left her mouth, to gauge whether anyone would react with alarm. No one did. And in the absence of resistance, the thought survived and grew. The emotional core of the motive argument was delivered by the prosecutor in a closing passage that the jury would later cite as the single most compelling moment of the trial. He said the evidence showed that Ava did not kill because she was in danger. She was not fleeing violence. She was not defending herself against an immediate physical threat. She was not responding to a crisis that offered no other exit. She killed because other people still had the right to tell her no. Her parents set boundaries. Her parents enforced rules. Her parents discovered behavior they considered dangerous and responded with the protective instincts that any reasonable parent would apply. And for Eva, that was enough. Not enough to run away, not enough to argue, not enough to ask for help from a teacher, a counselor, or any of the adults who surrounded her with resources and support. Enough to decide that the people who said no had forfeited their right to exist. The prosecutor paused after delivering that line and let it settle into the room the way a stone settles into water, disturbing everything it touches. The defense rested without calling Eva to the stand during the guilt phase. It was a strategic decision designed to preserve whatever sympathy remained in the jury's perception of her as a child. But the absence of her voice left the courtroom filled only with the voices of people who had known the family, tested the evidence, and measured the dimensions of what had been done. And those voices all pointed in the same direction. The jury did not need to hear Eva explain why. The evidence had already explained it for her. And the explanation was not trauma, it was not fear, it was not survival. It was entitlement so absolute that it treated 4 human lives as obstacles to personal comfort and removed them with the same emotional engagement that most people bring to clearing a desk. The prosecutor rested. Eva leaned toward her lawyer and whispered something that no microphone captured. Her lawyer's expression did not change. On the evidence screen behind the defense table, the family photograph still glowed under the courtroom lights. Daniel in uniform, Claire at a school event, Owen with his badge, Micah with his frosting. And in front of those photographs, separated by a few feet of courtroom air, sat the person who had decided all 4 of them were less important than her freedom. The chapter closed not with a dramatic gesture, but with a quiet, yet terrible contrast that no amount of legal argument could dissolve. The photographs were still. The girl was still. And the jury understood that only one of those silences was a choice. The jury returned after 11 hours of deliberation, a duration that suggested neither easy consensus nor irreconcilable division, but rather the careful, uncomfortable work of 12 people confronting a decision that none of them had been prepared for when they were selected. The foreman stood with a single sheet of paper and read the verdicts in a voice that was controlled, but not steady. Guilty on count 1, the killing of Inspector Daniel Mercer. Guilty on count 2, the killing of Claire Mercer. Guilty on count 3, the killing of Owen Mercer. Guilty on count 4, the killing of Micah Mercer. Each verdict was followed by a beat of silence, so total that the sound of the foreman turning the page to the next count was audible throughout the room. Claire's sister folded forward in her seat. One officer in the back row closed his eyes and pressed his knuckles against the wall behind him. A journalist stopped writing and stared at the floor. And Eva Mercer, who had maintained her posture and her composure through every day of the trial, did not move. She did not lower her head. She did not cry. She stared ahead with an expression that resembled not shock, but confirmation, as if she had known this was coming and had simply been waiting for the formality to conclude. The penalty phase began the following week and carried a different emotional weight than the guilt phase. The question was no longer what Eva had done. So the question was what the state would do in response. The defense brought forward a neurodevelopmental specialist who spoke at length about the adolescent brain, explaining that the regions governing empathy, consequence prediction, and moral reasoning are among the last to mature, often not reaching full development until the mid-20s. He argued that sentencing a 14-year-old to the ultimate penalty was not justice, but foreclosure, the permanent closing of a door that biology had not yet finished building. He presented brain imaging studies. He cited longitudinal research. He described cases in which juvenile offenders had undergone profound psychological transformation during incarceration, emerging decades later as fundamentally different people than the children who had committed their crimes. His testimony was measured, credible, and deeply uncomfortable for anyone who believed the crime demanded the harshest possible response, because the science was real. And the question it raised was not whether Eva deserved punishment, but whether punishment should be final when the mind being punished was still unfinished. The prosecution's penalty argument did not dismiss the science. It redirected the jury's attention to the specific characteristics of the crime. Planning measured in weeks, not minutes. Sedatives administered to disable protective adults. A weapon retrieved using a code obtained through deliberate surveillance. Children killed in their beds. A crime scene staged to deceive the very department the victim had served. Evidence destroyed. A false emergency call performed with theatrical precision. And in the days, weeks, and months following the arrest, a consistent pattern of indifference to the suffering caused, interest in financial outcomes, contempt for the proceedings, and the complete absence of any gesture, statement, or behavior that suggested the defendant experienced the deaths of her family members as a loss rather than a liberation. The prosecution argued that the question was not whether Eva's brain was fully developed. The question was whether the evidence demonstrated a mind so aligned with its own interests and so indifferent to the existence of others that the protections typically afforded to juveniles could not responsibly apply. The family impact statements occupied an afternoon that no one in the courtroom would ever describe without pausing. Claire's father spoke first. He stood at the podium with a piece of paper he had written on the night before, and his hands shook visibly as he unfolded it. He said he had lost a daughter, a son-in-law, 2 grandsons, and a granddaughter in a single night. He paused after saying that and then corrected himself. He said he had lost the granddaughter long before the night of the killings. He just had not known it yet. He described Owen asking him last Christmas whether police officers ever got scared, and how Daniel had answered that everyone gets scared, but the job is to be useful anyway. He described Micah drawing family pictures with his name spelled wrong because he was still learning how letters worked. He described Claire calling him every Sunday evening to check on him, even though she was the one who deserved checking on. And then he described the silence. The silence after the phone calls stopped. The silence in the house where he now lived alone. The silence that fills every room that used to hold the voices of people who are never coming back. He did not raise his voice. He did not point at Eva. He simply stood there and bled in the quietest way a person can bleed, and the courtroom absorbed every word without making a sound. Daniel's former partner gave the second impact statement. He was a large man with a thick voice and the kind of controlled bearing that comes from decades of professional composure. He said Daniel was the best officer he had ever worked with and the best friend he had ever had. He said the worst part of the case was not the murder. It was the betrayal. Daniel died in his own bed, in his own home. He targeted not by the criminals he had spent his career pursuing, but by the child he had spent his life raising. He died never knowing that the threat was inside his house. He died reaching upward in the dark, trying to protect his family, slowed by a substance placed in his drink by his own daughter. The partner's voice cracked once and then steadied. He said Daniel deserved to die, knowing who his enemy was. That, at least, would have been honest. Instead, he died confused, disoriented, and reaching for a woman who was already gone. The partner sat down and stared at the floor for the rest of the afternoon. The judge invited Ava to make a statement before sentencing. It was the moment the defense had prepared for, the last opportunity to present her as a human being capable of remorse, growth, and redemption. If she had apologized, even imperfectly, even awkwardly, the moment might have carried weight with the judge. If she had cried, even briefly, even unconvincingly, it might have created a sliver of doubt about the absoluteness of the prosecution's characterization. Instead, Ava stood and spoke for approximately 3 minutes in a voice that was steady, clear, and entirely focused on herself. She said her parents kept taking things from her. She said no one in the house listened to her when she tried to explain what she needed. She said the people in the courtroom had already decided who she was before the trial started, and nothing she could say would change that. She did not mention Daniel by name. She did not mention Claire. She did not mention Owen or Micah. She spoke about herself as if she were the injured party, and as if the courtroom owed her understanding rather than the other way around. When she finished, she sat down and folded her hands in her lap. It was the wrong speech for mercy, and every person in that room knew it the moment the last word left her mouth. Judge Victor Callahan delivered the sentence in the manner that had defined his career, calmly, precisely, and with the kind of quiet authority that does not need volume to make itself felt. He acknowledged Ava's age. He called it a factor of profound significance. He said the prospect of imposing the most severe penalty upon a 14-year-old offender was something that troubled him deeply and would trouble any person who believed in the capacity of human beings to change. He referenced international legal opinion. He noted that many jurisdictions and many scholars had argued forcefully that no child under any circumstances should face such a sentence. He said he had considered those arguments seriously. Then he said the law of his jurisdiction required him to examine not only the age of the defendant, but the totality of the conduct. And the totality of this conduct, he said, included premeditation measured in weeks, the chemical disabling of protective adults, the targeted killing of 4 family members, including 2 sleeping children, the deliberate staging of a false crime scene, the destruction of evidence, the manufacture of a false emergency narrative, and a sustained pattern of post-arrest behavior demonstrating neither remorse nor recognition of the humanity of the victims. He said the law provided room for mercy where remorse, humanity, or redeeming restraint could be identified. He said he had searched for those qualities in the record before him, and he had found none. He sentenced Ava Mercer to death. The word landed in the courtroom like the sound of a door closing in an empty building. For a moment, no one moved. The clerk's pen stopped. The journalist's fingers froze above their keyboards. Claire's father lowered his face into his hands. One officer in the back row pressed both palms against the wall as if trying to hold the room together. Then sound returned all at once, the way it does when the world resumes after a moment of collective paralysis. A chair scraped, a pen dropped to the floor. Someone released a sob that had been held too long and came out broken and formless. The handcuffs were applied. Eva was pulled gently to her feet. And for the first time since the trial began, her expression changed. The composure she had maintained through weeks of testimony, through footage and forensics and impact statements and the reading of her own search history, finally cracked. Not into sorrow, not into the grief that might have saved her if it had come sooner. Into stunned realization. The shield of youth had not held. The performance had not worked. The age she had counted on, the question she had typed into her laptop weeks before the killings, had been answered. And the answer was not the one she had expected. The smirk that had opened this story was gone. In its place was something smaller, quieter, and infinitely more human. The face of a girl who had finally understood that the room was not going to bend for her. The sentence did not close the story. It fractured it into 1,000 smaller arguments that spread outward from the courtroom like cracks through glass. International human rights organizations issued condemnations within hours. Legal scholars published opinion pieces arguing that the execution of a 14-year-old, regardless of the crime, represented a failure of civilization rather than a triumph of justice. Child advocacy groups staged protests outside the courthouse. Amnesty monitors filed formal objections. The case became a symbol not only of the crime itself, but of the legal and moral structures that surrounded it. And the debate that erupted was as passionate and unresolvable as the crime was devastating and clear. On the other side of the argument stood the families who had buried 4 people in 1 week. They answered the condemnations with a simple question that no legal framework could fully resolve. What would you call justice for 2 children who were killed in their beds by the person they trusted most? The argument continued. It would continue long after the headlines faded, and no one who participated in it walked away feeling certain they were entirely right. Appeals were filed automatically under the jurisdiction's capital review procedures, and the legal process that followed would stretch across months and likely years. But the emotional closure of the case did not live in appellate briefs or procedural motions. It lived in the collapse of the illusion Eva had built around herself. She had believed from the moment she typed that search query into her laptop that her age was an impenetrable barrier between herself and the most severe consequence the law could impose. She had planned the crime with that belief as her foundation. She had staged the scene, cleaned the evidence, performed the 911 call, and sat in the ambulance wrapped in a shock blanket and whispered about masked intruders, all because she was certain that even if the truth emerged, the system would look at her face, calculate her years, and pull back from the edge. She was wrong, and the realization that she was wrong did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. It arrived in stages, each one smaller and more devastating than the last. The interrogation, the arrest, the competency hearing, the trial, the verdict, and finally the sentence that fell from Judge Callahan's mouth like the closing of a book she had believed she was still writing. The Mercer family was remembered not through the trial, but through the ordinary traces they left behind. Daniel's folded flag was displayed in Claire's father's study, beside a photograph taken at the police academy graduation more than 20 years earlier, showing a young man with a serious expression and a future he believed would be defined by service. Claire's counseling office at the school sat empty for weeks after the trial. Colleagues could not bring themselves to remove her things. Eventually, her sister came and packed the desk herself, placing the family photograph Claire had kept beside her computer into a cardboard box without looking at it. The boys' school held a quiet ceremony and planted 2 trees in the playground, one for Owen and one for Micah. A small plaque at the base of each tree gave only the names and the years. No explanation, no narrative. Just 2 lives that began and ended too soon, rooted now in soil that children would walk past every day without knowing the weight of what was planted there. Captain Lena Ortiz gave one interview after the trial concluded. She sat across from the journalist in a department conference room and spoke with the kind of measured honesty that had defined her investigation from the beginning. She said the hardest cases were not the bloodiest. They were the ones where love existed in the same rooms as violence. She said the Mercer house had contained both, and that the investigation had required her to hold both truths simultaneously without allowing either to distort the evidence. She said Ava was intelligent, and that intelligence had made the case both easier and harder. Easier because intelligent perpetrators leave more complex traces that ultimately expose them. Harder because intelligence in a child makes the crime feel more deliberate and therefore more difficult to reconcile with the instinct to protect the young. She also said something that was quoted widely in the weeks that followed. She said stage scenes always fail because they imitate logic, not life. Real grief is messy, she said. It does not organize itself. It does not clean up after itself. It does not compose text messages on the phones of the people it has lost. Ava's version of the night was too neat. And neatness in the aftermath of violence is the loudest confession a crime scene can make. The moral question that the case left behind was deliberately unresolvable, and that irresolution was part of its lasting power. Was justice served? The prosecution said yes. The defense said the system failed a child. The family said nothing could truly serve justice when 4 people were gone and the instrument of their destruction shared their blood. The public divided and redivided along lines that shifted depending on which aspect of the case a person chose to hold closest. The crime, the age, the evidence, the sentence, the science of the developing brain, or the image of Micah's blanket wrapped around a weapon in a drainage canal. Would forgiveness even be imaginable if you were the judge? Would you have looked at Ava's face and seen a child or a calculation? Would you have spoken the sentence or found a reason to stop? The story did not answer those questions for the audience. It placed them on the table and stepped back. Because the weight of a case like this does not belong to the narrator. It belongs to every person who hears it and has to decide, in the privacy of their own conscience, where the line falls between mercy and accountability. The Mercer house was boarded shut 3 weeks after the trial ended. The windows were covered with plywood. The front door was sealed with a padlock. The garden, which Claire had maintained with seasonal flowers and a small herb bed near the kitchen window, began to overgrow within days. The neighbors stopped looking at it. They walked past on the other side of the street. Children who used to play on the sidewalk in front of it were redirected by parents who did not explain why. The house became an absence, a shape that occupied space without being present, a structure that still stood but no longer meant anything except the thing that had happened inside it. In the property room of the district courthouse, evidence boxes were sealed and cataloged. Each one bore a case number and a name. Daniel Mercer's badge, once worn on his chest at ceremonies, parades, and the school events his children attended, now rested inside a labeled envelope alongside ammunition reports, forensic summaries, and the testimony transcripts of people who had loved him. Authority had not saved his home. It had not protected his family. But it had told the truth after the blood. And sometimes that is the only thing the law can promise. Ava Mercer began this story believing she could erase every voice that had ever challenged her. She believed that if the people who told her no were removed, the world would reorganize itself around her desires and leave her standing in the center, unquestioned and free. She used her father's knowledge, her mother's trust, her brother's innocence, and her own youth as instruments in a plan designed to replace a family with a silence she could finally control. She almost succeeded. The staging was nearly good enough. The 911 call was nearly convincing enough. The washing was nearly thorough enough. But nearly is the word that separates every failed deception from every successful one. And in the end, it was not a detective's brilliance or a prosecutor's rhetoric that defeated her. It was a motion-activated camera on a neighbor's fence, a warm washing machine no one started, a fingerprint on an ammunition tray too small to notice, and a blanket too personal to forget. The truth did not arrive dramatically. It arrived quietly, in pieces, through the ordinary persistence of evidence that does not know how to lie. And when the last piece fell into place, the only sound left in the courtroom was a judge's voice, calm, measured, impossible to charm, delivering a sentence that Ava Mercer will carry for the rest of her life. The chains moved, the gavel fell, and the smirk that had opened this story disappeared into a silence even she could not control. If you think justice was served, make sure others see this story too.